What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. So it's been a couple weeks. I've been waiting on parts to come in, and I'm just now getting around to being able to do this. I'm going to be fixing the front suspension on the Mercedes. If you guys have watched any of the previous videos where I introduced this car to the channel, this car was hit in this corner. Obviously I've got some body damage here and bumper missing here, but I recently did an alignment check on it and found that there was negative 3.5 degrees of camber in this corner, and the toe's a little messed up as well. It's obvious I did a little measuring here and there, best I could for the situation that was presented to me, and something up here is bent. I don't really know what, but something is bent. So in lieu of going after replacing one part at a time, I actually just ordered all of the suspension parts for this corner. I got all new control arms, upper and lower, new ball joint, new bearings, and all that stuff. I have a used steering knuckle here. Obviously, I don't know the condition of the steering knuckle, so this may be a little bit of a gamble, but a new steering knuckle was incredibly expensive, so I'm willing to take the risk at this point in time. But we're going to get all that stuff put on here. Obviously, this is only going to be half of the job, but you'll get the idea of how to take all these arms off or replace the steering knuckle if that's what you're doing on your vehicle. So let's get to it. Alright, so I just wanted to give a little update up until this point. I got my brake caliper off. Those are 218s holding that on. I re-threaded my bolts back into my caliper so they're not rolling on the floor. Held the caliper up with some kind of bungee cord. You're not supposed to let it hang by this hose, just because it can actually separate the hose internally and cause damage to it. So you're supposed to hang the caliper by something other than the hose. Brake rotor off. That was a T30 holding the brake rotor on, and then just if your brake rotor has been off recently, you're gonna have to knock it loose, but mine's been off and replaced recently, so it just pulled right off. Next we're gonna work on getting the lower control arm, the mount for the shock off this lower control arm. We're gonna get the sway bar end link back here off of where it mounts the control arm. I'm not going to actually replace the sway bar end link. I'm just going to get it off of this lower control arm because I'm replacing this lower control arm. And then I'm going to get this other control arm over here unmounted from where it mounts here at the subframe. I'm probably going to end up having to take some of the splash shielding off underneath the car in order to get to the bolts for that. So let's get to it. Alright, just a little update as to where I'm at this point. I got the bolt out for this shock. I got the sway bar end link off of the lower control arm. The nut and bolt for this shock are both 21s on both sides. The sway bar end link is a 21 nut holding on to this little ball joint that's built in the lower control arm, and also a 21mm nut holding it to the sway bar. You have to loosen that in order to be able to pivot this off of here, off of the ball joint in the arm. Both the front arm and the middle arm, or the main lower control arm, have 21mm nuts and E14 Torx heads on the bolts holding them in. So I got the 20mm nut off of both of them. I got the bolts still in there holding everything in place. The tie rod end is also a 21. Only special tool that I have needed so far up to this point is a ball joint or tie rod separator. Use that to separate the tie rod end from the steering knuckle. If you don't have one of those, usually some tapping or hammering on the side of the steering knuckle here, as well as hitting down on top of the tie rod, kind of going back and forth between the two, will knock it loose from the steering knuckle. Of note, if you're going to hit on the top of this tie rod, put the nut back on the top of it and run it down until it's the castle nut part of it is flush with it, so you don't mushroom the threads of the tie rod itself and damage it. Just FYI for you guys. So all I have left to do is I got to get the bolts that go through the upper control arm into the body of the car off, and I'll be ready to pull all of the suspension stuff off. Alright, so I got everything put back in as far as arms go. Upper control arm mounted back in place. Lower control arm back in place. Sway bar link is back through. This bolt's just through, but it's not tight yet. This arm's back in place, but not tight yet. All I got left to do is put the steering knuckle in, and then I got to load the suspension up to ride height, which I'll use the jack to do. To tighten down all these, because if you don't, you have to load all these bushings, or tighten down all these bushings when they're at ride height, because if you tighten them up when they're sagged out, then when you lower the car down, it's actually going to be twisting the rubber in this bushing just for the car to sit at ride height, and it'll actually cause these bushings to end up wearing out faster. So you have to tighten down all the bolts that have control, like rubber bushings through them. So this one, that one, and these upper arm up here with the car at ride height, so that these bushings are in their like rested state at ride height, so when they're moving up and down through suspension travel, they're twisting from ride height, so it doesn't wear them out any faster. I wanted to show you guys this. I actually took my steering knuckle to work with me and pressed a ball joint out. I needed something to be able to hold the steering knuckle, and I don't have a vise here as of yet, so I was able to use the vise at work and a ball joint tool. I personally own this ball joint tool, but you can rent this ball joint tool from any auto parts store. But I was able to press a bushing out. It seriously took me 3 minutes to push that bushing out once I had it set up in a vise and this all set up the right way. Here's one other thing I wanted to show you guys. I already rebuilt all of this, but this is kind of a weird, I've never seen this before. This axle, this bolt that holds this on, I have to tighten this up. I'm going to do it once I get this mounted in the car and I'm able to spin this and load it up right. But this nut spins off, it's threaded. And then when you get it tightened down to the torque spec, there's an Allen in the side of it that you actually tighten down, and it squeezes this onto the thread so that the nut doesn't back off. I've never seen that before. It's a very interesting way of doing it. Usually you have like a castle nut that either has a cotter pin through it or it's like a stake nut or something like that. But I like this way. This is cool. So we're going to get the steering knuckle thrown back in and get everything wrapped up. Alright, so as you can see, I got everything back together. Like I said, don't forget, use a jack to load up the suspension. You can either use the jack or put a jack stand underneath it and lower the weight of the car down onto the jack stand until the suspension is loaded up and the weight comes off of the jack. I picked this up with the jack until the car picked up off of the jack stand here. Once the jack picks up, the jack on the suspension picks the weight of the car up off this jack, it's loaded up into the ride height position. And then I did the upper control arm, that control arm bolt, that control arm bolt, and this shock mount right here as well. Like I said, anything that has a rubber bushing in it needs to be loaded up before you tighten the bolt all the way. So everything here looks good. Everything's tightened back up. I'm going to put the wheel back on and we're going to lower it down on the ground, and we're going to see whether or not this looks like it's any better than it was before. Alright, so as you guys can see, there is not negative 3.5 degrees of camber in there anymore. So it appears as though something in that suspension was actually bent and it wasn't in any part of the body. Look, going this way too. So some part of this steering knuckle, control arm, something in here is bent. Like I said, I believe that it was this part of the control arm here where it went on the tire, just off of the measurements that I did. It was either this, or my other thought was it was possibly this part here where the wheel bearing mounts to the spindle. It's actually like a spindle, kind of like a two-wheel drive pickup truck, and I was concerned that there's possibility that where it meets the steering knuckle here, that it was bent up, causing it to have such bad camber. But realistically, I'm not going to go through the trouble trying to figure out what it is, because replacing all the suspension on the front of it fixed the problem. So I appreciate you guys for watching the video. If this helped anybody with doing any front end work on their own Mercedes of this, this body style, whether it was a wagon or a sedan or anything like that, please like the video, comment down below if you have any questions, and I would really appreciate it if you guys would subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys later.